talk about wax resist glazing and different things you can do to add a little interest or change up your pot decoration. You are going to need to get yourself some wax resist. This is really important when you're picking up your wax resist from High Water. Make sure that it's the oil-based wax resist. You do not want Forbes wax. That is a water-based wax resist, and it won't work for what we're doing with this. So you need a Mobile or a Laguna wax, mobile wax. This Laguna sells it. Amico also sells it. You can get it online or from High Water. You need your pot. And then you are also going to need some brushes. So I have a series of brushes here that I've made over the years or collected. So I'm going to use these. You also need to use gloves if you're back in the glaze area. All right, so when you're wax resisting, the first step is to put some wax on the bottom of your foot. So on the foot ring here, you're going to take a brush and brush that on with your mobile wax, or you can dip it in the wax station. Remember that you need gloves in this area. And then also one thing I want to note is when you order this from High Water or Blick or Ceramic Shop or wherever you're getting a wax from, it's going to come very stark white. And if you're using a white clay body, this is pretty hard to see when you put on the pot. So you can go to the grocery store and get some food coloring, and you can put a little bit of food coloring in it so that you can see where you're putting it on that pot. It helps. So you take your soft brush and you're gonna wax all the way around that foot ring. Try not to drip any wax where you're intending to put glaze, because the only way to get that off is to refire your pot. Alright, so after this dries, it's going to take it a minute, so it won't be shiny anymore. I'm going to dunk it really fast in and out of water, and the reason I do that is because right now this pot is super dry, and it would suck up so much glaze that it would be way too thick on the pot, and it would crawl or run, or it would just shiver right off the pot before it even goes in the kiln. So we don't want any of that. Another reason why you would want to dunk this really fast in and out of water is because you want to get any kind of dust off of it, because those crawling issues can happen with that as well. And your pot's no longer functional at that point, so that can be very frustrating. You want to put your brush and your wax off to the side, and I would recommend that you wash your brushes right away and put a little soap on the bristles, and that will keep them functioning. If you leave wax in a brush, it kind of ruins it. So, you know, just keep that in mind. And then we're gonna go ahead and once this pot is dipped in water and we wait for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're gonna start putting our first coat of glaze on. Okay, so what you want to do is sieve your glaze. If you have difficulty lifting these buckets because they can be heavy when they're full, you can lean it on the edge and you can sort of cantilever it off of the edge of that bucket. Here I'm hardly holding on to it. If you still have trouble sieving your glazes, you can get away with not doing it, but just be aware that sometimes if it's a freshly made glaze, you'll have different little elements that aren't completely sieved or dissolved. The best way to do it to make sure it looks like the tile on the board is to sieve it. If you don't sieve it, mix it up quite a lot to make sure that you get all that glaze homogenized all the way through. Okay, I'm gonna dip this little wine goblet that I've waxed and dipped in water in speckled white, and white will be my base. Note I'm holding that pot at the top, and that'll make it easier to pour that glaze out of the cup portion when you're holding it with your tongs. Give it a little shake. Get that excess glaze off, and then you're going to want to wipe the glaze off the bottom with a wet sponge. So the first wax resist design that I'm going to show you here is really simple stripes. Not everybody is comfortable decorating and doing a lot of brushwork, and that's okay. You don't have to be. So I'm going to come through here and find a pretty straightforward store-bought straight brush. I'm gonna have this cloth near to me. Any kind of towel from your home will do. This is to keep the stuff off your hands, particularly because we're wearing gloves. We can't feel if we've got stuff on the surface of our hands, and I want to keep the surface of this pot fairly clean. So this has been dipped in speckled white. I typically try to go with a pretty light palette on the bottom, and then I'll add darker colors on top of that. That's when I'm doing real fancy brushwork. So this is almost like gessoing a canvas. You can go darker and then lighter on top if you're just doing designs. So that would be like stripes or circles or dots or anything like that, because then the design shows through. It doesn't really matter. If you're getting really painterly with this and you want it to look like an image, then you for sure want to make sure that you're going light to dark with your glazes. I would also recommend that you don't layer more than 2 glazes. When you start layering 3 glazes on top of each other with this technique, then pots and glazes, the glazes tend to stick to the shelf because it's just too much glaze on the pot. So I'm gonna just kind of start working downward, and I'm just gonna work some stripes across this surface with my mobile wax. So this is Laguna brand mobile wax. And if you work down away from the pot, that just ensures that if it drips, it's dripping on your table and not on the bottom of your pot where you don't want that wax. So I'm going to put this aside, but you remember we just talked about washing your brushes out so you don't ruin your brushes. So I highly recommend that, or you will have to buy a lot of brushes. So you can see here where there's wax that's still not dry and where it is dry. And then I also addressed the bottom, right? Because, you know, it's kind of fun to, when people are checking out your pots and your work, and then there's little surprises underneath there. I love that when I go check out pottery shows, that they've thought about that too. So that's just a little something to consider when you're decorating. It's very important, make sure that this wax is very, very dry before you dip your second coat of glaze. If you don't, it's not gonna resist the glaze and it'll just be a big mess. So you'll see that that's really, really dry. You can see also in here where it's not dry. So just be patient and wait. Have a couple of things that you're working on, and you can come through and decorate the next thing with wax while you're waiting on your first thing to dry. Okay, so on this next one, what I'm gonna do is show you how to draw some really simple little flower forms on your pot. And we're gonna use mason stains, which are these. This is actually a recipe that is from Linda Arbuckle, and she gave this recipe out as a way not to buy the stains. So these stains are meant to go on top of maiolica or any kind of white clay body. Here they're on top of a cone 6 clear, which has zinc in it, and that does affect color. Zinc and glazes affects color significantly. So it's good to kind of use this as like a general loose reference for how these are going to look, but remember that these are not commercially made. They're oxides mined out of the earth. That means that they're gonna change with heat and temperature and time. So the hotter you fire things, the more the color is going to be affected in a kiln, in addition to the materials that are in the glaze that you're using. Color for some interest, you can do that at this point. So I'm going to take this as just a little bit of orange, stir it up. And then we'll just give it a little bit of highlight there. Now I'm going to take and I'm going to frame this little flower. So my recommendation is that when you find your brushes, you find a liner brush and you practice with it, because different brushes will make different thicknesses in line. If you want it super fine, if you want it to be thinner. So you can practice with it on newspaper. And I'm just basically taking the tip of the brush and just kind of barely touching the surface of what I'm painting in it. So that's where you can get your kind of finer lines. So practice on a table or a piece of newspaper, kind of making those lines. When you're waxing this back, you want to make sure that your bristles are very soft. You don't want a stiff brush for this. just a little helpful trick. Really fine lines that you're trying to wax are hard to get to resist, so you can make the line a little thicker with your wax or your brush, and or put the wax on thicker, but you're gonna have to wait longer for it to dry, or you'll have that problem of it not resisting. Is all about the brush, and I have different ones I've mentioned. For this one, since I just want some pretty broad leaf shapes, I'm gonna go with this brush here. So just a regular store-bought flat bristle brush. Because I've waxed on top of these roses, I don't have to be too concerned about getting close to that image. And then I'm gonna come through and add some copper framing. So that copper carb, what I just used for the leaves is this yellowish green chartreuse color, and then I'm gonna come through with this darker copper carbonate color and do some framing. I do want to mention, when you're doing this, if you notice that you've got any wet parts, and then you go to, so any wet parts of your mason stain, or if you're using underglazes in this, and you try to wax that away or wax it back, you're gonna smear the color on the glaze. So make sure everything is really dry before you go to put that layer of wax on top of your color. In addition, the other thing I want to mention is these mason stains, when they're thicker, particularly this copper carbonate and the cobalt carbonate that I'm using here, when they're thicker, they tend to run. So just be aware of that. And then when this copper carbonate is thicker, it does tend to go very dark black. So, you know, you may not want that on your pot. Just a word of caution. Alright, once these dry, we'll talk about just dipping our second color, and then you'll be done. And these go on the cone 6 shelf because these are the glazes that I'm using. But you could use this process in cone 10. Just remember that the hotter you fire, the more your colors will change in terms of underglazes and mason stains and things like that. So these stains will not look the same at 10 as they do at 6. They tend to get a little bit duller, or they'll just shift color altogether. So keep that in mind. Another thing that you can do is use stickers as a method for making dots or circles on your pot. Sometimes your stickers have a hard time sticking, so be aware of that. Push them in really well before you wax. You can also use painter's tape or architecture tape, whatever they call that, planning tape. Just another thing to think about. Okay, so when you're dunking your second glaze on your pot, you want to remember that you need a wet sponge near to you, what's going to happen is it will resist, but you're going to have dots of glaze on top of that wax. You need to wipe those away while that glaze is still wet. If you let it dry on the pot, it's going to be hard to get off. And in addition to that, if you don't wipe it away at all, it's going to fire on the pot and you'll have specks of glaze on top of your design, which you don't want. The wax melts away, but that glaze will stay there. So make sure you wipe that away. And then lastly, if you wanted to come back in and add a little more enhancement to the exposed glaze areas that are not waxed back, you can. The back end of a brush makes for excellent little miniature dots. Sometimes I'll come back in and add lines to things with a nice fine liner brush. So, you know, the sky's the limit. I encourage you to play and take notes on what you do so that you can remember and repeat the things that you love. Be careful not to touch the wax when you set these on the shelf, because sometimes that wax, particularly when it's drying, because it still is drying, it will come off on your hand. It'll take your decoration away with it. So just kind of, when you set them on the shelves, just try to grab an area that's not waxed and make sure that it's dry when you handle it as well.